You can buy a table at the city's most exclusive charity gala for $50,000. You can buy the sycophantic smiles of board members, the forced laughter of competitors, and a dress woven from silk and status. But Claire Montgomery, a woman whose net worth eclipsed the GDP of small island nations, was currently staring at her 7-year-old daughter across a sea of crystal glassware, realizing the one thing her money couldn't buy was a single person in this room who could speak her child's language. The interior of the Maybach was a sanctuary of climate-controlled silence. Outside, the December wind whipped off the harbor, biting through the coats of pedestrians scurrying along the pavement. Inside, there was only the hum of the engine and the soft, rhythmic tapping of Lily's patent leather shoes against the floorboard. Claire watched her daughter in the dim light of the street lamps filtering through the tinted windows. Lily was 7. She wore a dark velvet dress that Claire had paid an absurd amount of money for, mostly to ensure it wouldn't itch. Lily hated things that itched. She hated tight collars and stiff fabrics, and most of all, she hated the kind of events they were currently driving toward. 10 minutes, Claire signed, her hands moving with a practiced, fluid grace. We stay for dinner. We take the pictures. Then we go home and watch the movie. Lily looked at her mother's hands, then up to her face. She didn't sign back. She just gave a slow, deliberate nod and turned her gaze back to the window. Claire swallowed the hard knot in her throat. She was the CEO of Montgomery Holdings. She managed hostile takeovers before her morning coffee. She gutted failing subsidiaries and stared down venture capitalists without blinking. But the quiet resignation in her 7-year-old daughter's eyes was the one thing that consistently broke her. Lily was profoundly deaf. She had been since birth. Claire had spent the first 3 years of Lily's life fighting a quiet, desperate war against doctors who pushed for implants, against therapists who insisted on speech reading, against a world that demanded Lily mold herself to fit its auditory convenience. Claire had chosen American Sign Language. She had learned it late at night, exhausted, her eyes burning as she watched instructional videos while corporate briefs piled up on her desk. She wanted Lily to have a language that belonged to her, one that didn't require her to strain and struggle just to exist. But the reality of Claire's world was that it was brutally, unforgivingly auditory, and tonight was the pinnacle of that world, the St. Jude's Winter Gala, a mandatory appearance, a display of power and philanthropy that Claire could not afford to skip. The car glided to a halt in front of the Grand Hotel. The valet opened the door, and the silence of the car was instantly shattered by the outside world. Claire stepped out, the winter air shocking her skin. She reached back, offering her hand. Lily took it, her small fingers wrapping tightly around Claire's. The flashbulbs started immediately. Strobe lights of harsh white fractured the darkness. Claire pasted on her media smile. It was a tight, controlled expression that conveyed exactly nothing. She looked down at Lily. Lily was looking at the ground, her face entirely impassive. She was used to this. She knew how to navigate the physical space of a crowd, reading the shifts in weight and the movement of shadows to avoid being stepped on. They walked up the red carpet, a gauntlet of shouted questions and aggressive posturing. Once inside the lobby, the noise shifted from sharp shouts to a deafening roar of overlapping conversations, clinking glasses, and a string quartet struggling to be heard over the din of aggressive networking. Claire, darling. It was Richard Vance. No, wait, Richard Sterling. Claire mentally kicked herself. She knew these men, these interchangeable men in their bespoke tuxedos with their aggressive cologne and their predatory smiles. Richard, Claire said, her voice perfectly modulated. Good to see you. And this must be the little one, Richard boomed, leaning down. He didn't look at Lily's face. He looked at her ear, searching for a device, an aid, a piece of technology he could understand. Finding none, he overcompensated. He leaned in far too close, his face red from scotch, and spoke with exaggerated, grotesque lip movements. Hello, are you having fun? Claire felt a spike of pure, unadulterated rage. She didn't scream. She didn't shove him backward, though her hand twitched with the impulse. Instead, she calmly stepped between Richard and her daughter. "She is deaf, Richard. She isn't stupid," Claire said, her tone dropping 10 degrees. "And she doesn't read lips. If you want to ask her a question, you can look at her, and I will translate." Richard stood up straight, his face flushing a deeper shade of red. "Right. Of course. Apologies. Hard to know the protocol, isn't it?" He forced a laugh, patted Claire on the shoulder, and melted back into the crowd. Claire turned to Lily. She crouched down, her silk dress pooling on the marble floor, ignoring the fact that a photographer was definitely taking a picture of this. "Are you okay?" Claire signed. Lily nodded. She signed back, her movements small, kept close to her chest. "He smells like rotten apples." Claire let out a sharp, genuine bark of laughter. It earned her a few strange looks from passing executives, but she didn't care. "Yes, he does," she signed back. "Come on, let's find our table." They navigated the ballroom. It was a masterpiece of forced festivity. Towering centerpieces of frosted pine and white roses dominated the tables, effectively blocking anyone from making eye contact across the room. The lighting was dim, designed to make the jewelry sparkle, but it made seeing hand shapes incredibly difficult. For a deaf person, bad lighting wasn't a mood setter. It was a gag. Claire found table 1, the power table. She pulled out a chair for Lily, positioning her so she had a clear view of the room and, more importantly, a clear view of Claire. As the other guests arrived and took their seats, the isolation set in. Claire was immediately flanked by 2 tech billionaires who began talking over her, using her physical presence as a sounding board for their own egos. Claire nodded, interjected precisely when necessary to maintain dominance, and kept her eyes locked on Lily. Lily sat perfectly still. She had pulled a small silver spoon from the elaborate place setting and was turning it over in her hands. She was watching the room, not the people, but the movement. The way the waiters moved in sync, the way the chandeliers cast fractured light on the ceiling. She was entirely alone in a room of 500 people. Claire reached under the table and tapped Lily's knee. Lily looked over. "Boring," Claire signed, keeping her hands low, hidden by the tablecloth. "Very," Lily signed back, a tiny, ironic smile touching her lips. Claire felt a pang of profound guilt. She was a billionaire. She could buy companies. She could buy islands. She could buy legislation. But she couldn't buy her daughter an hour of genuine, effortless inclusion. The first course arrived. A pale, complicated foam sitting atop a sliver of raw fish. Lily stared at it with polite disdain. Claire didn't even bother telling her to try it. She discreetly pushed her own untouched plate away and signaled a passing waiter. "Could you bring a plate of plain dinner rolls?" Claire asked quietly. "And butter. Real butter, not the truffle kind." The waiter nodded and vanished. To Claire's left, a venture capitalist named Harrison was deep into a monologue about blockchain integration in third-world supply chains. Claire was tracking the conversation out of professional habit, but her focus remained tethered to her daughter. Lily had abandoned the spoon and was now tracing the heavy embroidery on the tablecloth. Her posture was shrinking. It was a defense mechanism Claire had watched develop over the past year. When the auditory world became too oppressive, too fast, and too visually chaotic to decode, Lily simply folded inward. She became small. She shut the world out before it could shut her out. It was agonizing to watch. Claire surveyed the room, desperate for a distraction. Her eyes scanned the adjacent tables. Table 2, Table 3. Mostly executives, politicians, media moguls. But at Table 4, tucked slightly behind a massive, obnoxious ice sculpture of a reindeer, there was an anomaly. A man. Late 30s, maybe early 40s. He wasn't wearing a tuxedo. He was wearing a dark charcoal suit. It was clean, well-pressed, but it wasn't bespoke. It was the kind of suit a man buys for weddings and funerals, worn with the stiff discomfort of someone who prefers rolled-up sleeves. He had dark hair, slightly graying at the temples, and a face that looked tired but kind. He was clearly out of his depth. He wasn't networking. He wasn't scanning the room for better opportunities. He was entirely focused on the boy sitting next to him. The boy looked about 8. He was currently in the process of attempting to balance a butter knife on the rim of his water glass. The man reached out and gently tapped the boy's wrist. The boy looked up. Claire watched, her breath catching slightly. The man didn't speak. Instead, his hands moved. It wasn't a large, performative gesture. It was quick, casual, and incredibly fluent. Knife falls, water spills, you clean it up with your shirt. The boy grinned, dropping the knife back onto the tablecloth. He signed back, his small hands moving clumsily but enthusiastically. "I have a napkin." "Napkins are for the food you aren't eating." The man signed back, his face completely deadpan. Claire felt a strange jolt in her chest. It was American Sign Language, not the stiff textbook signs of a hobbyist, but the smooth vernacular flow of someone who lived in the language. Who was he? How was he here? He didn't have the polished, predatory look of the C-suite. He looked like an architect, or perhaps an engineer, someone who actually built things, rather than just moving money around. Claire glanced sharply at Lily. Lily hadn't seen. She was still staring at her lap, her shoulders hunched. "Excuse me, Claire?" Harrison was saying, his voice cutting through her observation. "I said, don't you agree that the overhead on the Singapore project is bloated?" Claire dragged her attention back to the table. She looked at Harrison. He was waiting for validation. He wanted her to agree so he could use her name in a board meeting later. "I think," Claire said slowly, her voice freezing the air around them, "that if you can't manage the overhead in Singapore, you shouldn't be running the project, Harrison." Harrison blinked, stunned. The sycophantic smile slipped off his face, replaced by a tight, offended line. "Well, I suppose that's one way to look at it." He turned away, suddenly intensely interested in the person sitting on his other side. Claire didn't care. She turned back to Lily. The waiter had delivered a small plate of plain rolls. Claire took one, broke it in half, and pushed the plate toward her daughter. Lily looked up. She took a piece of the bread. She chewed it slowly, mechanically. "Better?" Claire signed. Lily nodded. "It tastes like nothing. Better than the fish." Claire smiled softly. 10 more minutes until the speeches start. Then we can leave." Lily didn't respond. She just looked past Claire, her eyes drifting across the room. Claire tracked her gaze. Lily was looking toward table 4. The man in the charcoal suit, Claire decided to think of him as the architect, was now cutting a piece of chicken for his son. The boy was saying something, his mouth moving, but the architect wasn't looking at his lips. He was nodding, focused on the food, occasionally glancing up. Then the boy dropped his fork. It clattered loudly against the china. The architect looked up. He didn't scold. He just raised an eyebrow. The boy looked sheepish. He signed, "Accident." The architect signed back, "Gravity Works." From across the room, at the billionaire's table, Claire saw Lily sit up straight. Lily's eyes were wide. She leaned forward, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. She wasn't looking at the ice sculpture. She wasn't looking at the dresses. She was staring directly at the architect and his son. She had seen the hands. Claire watched her daughter's face transform. The dull, resigned mask melted away. For the first time all evening, there was light in Lily's eyes. It was a look of profound, desperate hunger. The hunger of someone stranded in a foreign country who suddenly hears their native tongue spoken across a crowded room. The speeches began. The lights dim further, plunging the tables into shadows while a spotlight hit the main stage. The CEO of the Hospital Foundation strode to the microphone, armed with a 30-page speech about synergy, philanthropy, and the power of capital. Claire hated this part. It was the theatrical justification for the evening's excess. But tonight, she barely heard a word. Her entire focus was triangulated between her daughter, the man at table 4, and the empty space between them. Lily was vibrating with tension. She sat on the very edge of her chair, twisting her body to get a clear line of sight past the massive floral arrangements. At table 4, the architect had leaned back in his chair. He was watching the speaker on stage with polite, manufactured interest. His son, however, was rapidly losing a battle with boredom. The boy was twisting in his seat, sighing heavily, and kicking the leg of the table. The architect reached over and tapped the boy's shoulder. The boy turned. Because of the angle, Claire could clearly see the architect's hands in the dim wash of the stage light. "Stop kicking the table," the architect signed. His face was stern, but his hands were soft. "I'm bored," the boy signed back aggressively. "We are all bored. Endure it like a man." The boy rolled his eyes. "I am 8. Endure it like an 8-year-old man." Lily let out a sharp, sudden gasp of air. It wasn't quite a laugh. She rarely voiced her laughter, but the physical reaction was intense. Her hands flew up to cover her mouth, her eyes crinkling at the corners. She was eavesdropping. Claire felt a sudden, fierce protectiveness mingled with an overwhelming sense of relief. She didn't intervene. She just watched. Lily lowered her hands. She looked around the room, checking to see if anyone was paying attention to her. The billionaires at her table were entirely focused on the stage, their faces glazed over with boredom and expensive wine. Lily looked back at table 4. The boy had rested his chin on the table, looking utterly defeated by the length of the speech. The architect was rubbing his temples. Slowly, hesitantly, Lily raised her hands. She rested her elbows on the table to keep her movements small. "Hello," Lily signed. She aimed it directly at the boy, but the boy was looking at the tablecloth. The architect, however, saw it. Thomas Reed had been enduring the gala for 3 hours. He was only here because his firm had donated the architectural plans for the new hospital wing, and his boss had guilted him into taking the complimentary table. He felt like an imposter. He hated the suits, he hated the food, and he hated that he had dragged Leo to this miserable affair just because his sitter had canceled. He was currently calculating how early they could leave without causing a diplomatic incident when he caught a movement out of the corner of his eye. A flash of pale hands in the dim light. He turned his head slightly. Across the aisle, at the table directly in front of the stage, the table where the people who owned the city sat, a little girl in a dark velvet dress was staring at him. Her hands were raised. "Hello," Thomas blinked. He looked around, thinking she was signing to a parent, but the woman next to her, a striking woman with cold, calculating eyes, was staring rigidly at the stage. The little girl was looking right at him. Thomas hesitated. He hadn't expected to use ASL tonight with anyone but Leo. His late wife, Sarah, had been deaf. They had raised Leo bilingual from birth. Since Sarah passed away 3 years ago, signing had become a private language for him and his son, a way to keep her alive in their home. He looked at the little girl again. Her hands had dropped slightly, a look of disappointment crossing her face. She thought he was ignoring her. Thomas shifted in his chair, leaning slightly to his left to clear the sightline past the ice sculpture. He raised his right hand, resting his elbow on the armrest. "Hello," Thomas signed back. Small, casual. Lily flinched in surprise. Her eyes widened. She hadn't expected the adult to answer. She looked at him, then quickly looked away, suddenly shy. She began playing with her napkin again. Thomas smiled softly. He remembered this. Sarah used to tell him about the isolation of hearing events, the profound exhaustion of being surrounded by people and entirely alone. He tapped Leo's arm. Leo looked up, annoyed. Thomas pointed discreetly toward table 1. "Look at the girl in the velvet dress." Leo turned his head. He spotted Lily. He looked back at his dad. "What about her?" "Say hi," Thomas signed. Leo sighed, a heavy, dramatic 8-year-old sigh. He turned toward Lily. He raised a hand and waved. Lily saw the wave out of her periphery. She looked up. Leo didn't just wave. He signed. "Hi. I'm Leo. I'm dying of boredom." Lily stared at him. Then, slowly, a massive, genuine smile broke across her face. It transformed her entirely. The stiff, robotic child Claire had brought into the room vanished, replaced by a bright, radiant 7-year-old. "I am Lily," she signed back, her movements fluid and fast. "The man on stage has been talking for 100 years. Leo snorted loudly. A woman at the next table shushed him. Leo ignored her. My dad says he is talking just to hear his own voice. Leo signed. Lily looked at Thomas. Thomas gave a small, acknowledging nod, verifying the translation. Lily laughed again, a breathless, silent heave of her shoulders. Claire sat frozen. She was watching a miracle unfold in real time. She watched her daughter, who had spent the last 3 hours coiled tight like a spring, suddenly unwind. Lily was conversing. She was making a joke. She was connecting. And she was doing it in a room where Claire had assumed it was impossible. Claire turned her gaze to the man at table 4. Thomas Reed. She didn't know his name yet, but she was memorizing his face. The worn edges of his suit, the relaxed posture, the way his eyes crinkled when he watched his son make Lily laugh. He caught Claire looking. For a second their eyes locked across the cavernous, opulent room. Thomas immediately stiffened. He dropped his hands. He recognized the woman. Everyone knew Claire Montgomery. She was notorious, ruthless. He assumed he had just been caught distracting her child during a keynote speech. He gave a tight, apologetic nod and turned his attention back to the stage, tapping Leo to tell him to stop. Claire saw the retreat. She saw the man assume she was offended. Under the table, her hands clenched into fists. She didn't want him to stop. For the first time in years, someone was speaking her daughter's language, and she wasn't going to let corporate intimidation ruin it. Claire looked at Lily. Lily was looking at the tablecloth again, the light fading from her eyes as the boys turned away. Claire made a decision, a very uncorporate, deeply unstrategic decision. She stood up, right in the middle of the keynote speech. Harrison, the venture capitalist, hissed, "Claire, what are you doing? He's making the funding announcement." "I don't care," Claire whispered. She reached down, took Lily's hand, and pulled her gently from her chair. "Come with me," Claire signed. Lily looked confused, but she followed. Claire ignored the stares. She ignored the murmurs rippling through table 1 as the CEO of Montgomery Holdings walked away from the most important speech of the quarter. She navigated through the narrow spaces between the tables, her silk dress brushing against chairs, her eyes fixed entirely on table 4. Thomas Reed watched her approach, a feeling of absolute dread pooling in his stomach. He was about to be dressed down by a billionaire for letting his kid sign to hers. He mentally prepared an apology, hoping it wouldn't cost his firm the hospital contract. Claire stopped at the edge of his table. She didn't look at the other guests. She didn't look at the stage. She looked down at Thomas. The silence stretched for a terrifying second. Then Claire Montgomery raised her hands. Her signs were perfectly articulated, crisp, and undeniably clear. "Is this seat taken?" She signed to Thomas. "My daughter needs someone to talk to." Thomas Reed stared at the woman standing before him. The stage speakers were booming, projecting a graph about fiscal endowments, but a sudden, dense quiet had settled over table 4. Thomas looked at Claire's hands, suspended in the air. Her syntax was a little rigid, leaning slightly heavily on English word order, rather than the fluid spatial grammar of native ASL, but it was clear, practiced, and desperately sincere. He looked up at her face. Claire Montgomery's features were famously sharp, plastered across the covers of financial magazines as a symbol of corporate ruthlessness. But right now, the boardroom armor was cracked. Her jaw was tight. Her eyes held the unmistakable, terrified vulnerability of a mother out on a limb, waiting to see if the branch would hold. Thomas stood up. He didn't scramble. He didn't wipe his hands on his trousers or offer a sycophantic grin. He looked down at the 2 empty chairs to his right, abandoned 30 minutes earlier by a couple who had snuck out to the bar. He pulled one out. "Please," Thomas said aloud, keeping his voice low. Simultaneously, he signed, "Sit. We have space." Claire let out a breath she seemed to have been holding since she crossed the room. Her shoulders dropped a fraction of an inch. She guided Lily into the chair next to Leo, then took the seat beside Thomas. The transition was jarring. At table 1, the air was practically electrified with the aggressive tension of people trying to out-leverage each other. Here, behind the ridiculous ice reindeer, the air was just air. Lily didn't wait for introductions. She didn't look at Thomas or Claire. She turned entirely toward Leo. "Do you have a dog?" Lily signed. Her hands moved with a sudden, jerky speed, betraying her excitement. Leo stopped fidgeting with his napkin. He sat up. "No. My dad is allergic. I have a lizard." Lily's nose wrinkled in profound disgust. "Lizards are slimy." "He is dry," Leo shot back, highly offended. "His name is Rex. He eats live crickets." Lily leaned in, her eyes widening with a morbid, delighted curiosity. "Live ones. You watch him eat them?" Claire watched her daughter. Lily's hands were flying. Her face was animated, cycling through disgust, awe, and amusement in a matter of seconds. Claire felt a sudden, sharp ache behind her ribs. It was a physical pain, born from the realization of exactly how much her daughter had been starving for this simple, mundane interaction. Thomas settled back into his chair. He watched the kids for a moment, making sure Leo was behaving, before turning his head slightly toward Claire. "I'm Thomas," he said quietly. He didn't offer a hand to shake. Handshakes at these events were about establishing dominance. He just offered his name. "Claire," she replied. "I know." Claire stiffened slightly. The defensive walls, which had lowered an inch, instantly shot back up. You know." "Hard not to," Thomas said, his tone perfectly flat. "You're the only person here the Foundation president has thanked 4 times, and the valet practically bowed when your car pulled up." Claire looked at him, searching for the pivot. The moment where he would ask for a meeting, pitch a startup, or try to leverage this interaction. "And?" she asked, her voice dropping back to its customary chill. Thomas turned to fully face her. His eyes were dark, tired, and remarkably calm. "And nothing. I'm an architect with revered design. I was guilted into sitting at this table by my firm. I don't need venture capital, I don't have a pitch deck, and I frankly hate these events as much as you and your daughter seem to." Claire blinked. She studied his face. There was no hustle in his expression, just a weary solidarity. "He's a good signer," Claire said softly, gesturing with her chin toward Leo. Thomas looked at his son. Leo was currently mimicking the gruesome death of a cricket, much to Lily's silent, shaking amusement. "He is," Thomas said. His voice softened. "His mother was deaf. We raised him bilingual. It's just how we talk at home." Claire heard the past tense. Was. She didn't offer a hollow apology. She knew better than to offer cheap pity to someone navigating a profound loss. Instead, she asked a practical question. "Where did you learn?" Claire asked. "You don't sign like someone who took a community center class." "I learned for her." "When we started dating," Thomas said. He picked up his water glass, tracing the condensation on the outside. "I spent 2 years hanging out at deaf clubs, getting my signs corrected by terrifying 80-year-old women until I stopped looking like an idiot. It became my second language." He looked at Claire's hands resting on her lap. "You learned for her." "I did," Claire said. She looked at Lily. "It's difficult, the isolation. I can buy her the best tutors, the best visual tech in the world, but I can't buy her peers. She goes to a mainstream school with an interpreter. She does well, but she spends all day translating the world." "It's exhausting," Thomas signed, keeping his hands low by his waist. Claire looked at his hands, then back to his eyes. "Yes, it is." For the next 20 minutes, the keynote speech droned on, a white noise backdrop to the profound quiet of Table 4. Claire and Thomas didn't talk much. They didn't need to. They sat in the comfortable shared silence of parents watching their children simply exist without struggle. Lily and Leo were deep into a conversation about the fundamental flaws of the gala's dessert menu. "It is just a tiny cake," Leo signed, pointing aggressively at the untouched plate in the center of the table. "Why is it so small?" "Rich people hate being full," Lily signed back, completely deadpan. Thomas choked on a sip of water. He coughed, trying to cover his mouth with a napkin, his shoulders shaking. Claire turned to him, alarmed. "Are you all right?" Thomas nodded, wiping his eyes. He pointed at Lily. "Your daughter is ruthless." Claire looked at Lily, who was looking at Thomas with a perfectly innocent expression. Claire felt a sudden foreign warmth bloom in her chest. A genuine smile, unforced and entirely real, broke across her face. "She gets it from me," Claire said. The polite, synchronized applause signaled the end of the hostage situation on stage. The house lights blazed, instantly shattering the intimate shadows of Table 4. The room snapped back into its harsh, networking reality. The low hum of the string quartet started up again, and the scraping of 500 chairs hitting the marble floor echoed through the ballroom as the attendees stood up to mingle. The spell was broken. Claire felt the shift immediately. The invisible barrier that had protected their table dissolved. She saw the heads turning. She saw the whispers rippling through the crowd as the city's elite realized the CEO of Montgomery Holdings had abandoned the power table to sit with a mid-level architect in a cheap suit. Thomas felt it too. His posture straightened. He tugged at the cuffs of his shirt. "Ms. Montgomery!" The voice was loud, breathless, and soaked in desperation. Thomas closed his eyes for a brief, agonizing second. He knew that voice. David Higgins, the senior partner at Revere Design, came speed-walking through the maze of tables. His face was flushed, his bow tie slightly askew, and his eyes were locked on Claire with the terrifying intensity of a man who just found a winning lottery ticket on the sidewalk. "Ms. Montgomery," David repeated, arriving at their table and completely ignoring Thomas and the children. "David Higgins, senior partner, Revere Design. I cannot tell you what an honor it is to see you here tonight. We've been trying to get a meeting with your development team regarding the waterfront project for 6 months." Claire's demeanor shifted so fast it gave Thomas whiplash. The relaxed, tired mother vanished. In her place sat the billionaire. Her spine went rigid. The warmth in her eyes was replaced by a flat, Arctic freeze. "Mr. Higgins," Claire said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a razor edge that demanded total silence. "This is a charity dinner." David laughed nervously, wiping sweat from his forehead. Of course. Just taking the opportunity. Synergies, you know. I see you've met Tom. Good man. One of our drafters." Thomas didn't flinch, but Claire saw the subtle tightening of his jaw at the deliberate demotion. David was establishing hierarchy, making sure Claire knew Thomas was a subordinate, a stepping stone to the real decision-maker. Claire stood up. She was several inches shorter than David, but she somehow managed to look entirely down on him. "Thomas is an architect," Claire corrected him, her tone deadly smooth. "And he is currently occupied, as am I. If you want a meeting with my development team, Mr. Higgins, I suggest you submit a proposal that doesn't rely on cornering women at charity galas." David's face drained of color. He opened his mouth, closed it, and took a step back. Yes, of course. My apologies. Enjoy the evening." He turned and practically fled toward the bar. Claire watched him go, her expression impassive. She let out a slow, controlled breath. Thomas looked up at her. "You didn't have to do that. He writes my performance reviews. If he gives you a bad review because I rejected his appalling lack of social grace, you should work somewhere else," Claire stated, sitting back down. But the damage was done. The piece of the table was ruined. She looked at Lily. Lily had retreated. The chaotic noise of the room, the sudden arrival of the loud, sweating man, and the shift in her mother's posture had flipped a switch. The bright, animated girl was gone. Lily had pulled her arms in close to her chest, her eyes scanning the room with a hyper-vigilant, exhausted glare. She tapped Claire's arm. Loud, Lily signed. Too fast. Claire nodded. She knew the signs of sensory overload. The visual noise of 500 people gesturing, moving, and crowding the space was just as exhausting for Lily as a rock concert would be for a hearing child. "I know," Claire signed back. We are leaving. Claire picked up her small, ridiculously expensive clutch from the table. She looked at Thomas. Thomas was already helping Leo into his coat. He caught Claire's eye. Sensory burnout? Thomas asked quietly. Yes, Claire said, surprised he knew the term. It's time to go. The social contract has been fulfilled. We're hitting our limit too, Thomas said. He looked down at Leo, who was yawning widely, showing no attempt to hide his boredom. I promised him a greasy diner burger if he survived the night without breaking any glassware. Claire paused. She looked at Thomas, then at Leo, and finally at her daughter. Lily was watching Leo put on his coat. She looked miserable. The brief window of connection was closing, and she was about to be shoved back into the quiet, isolating bubble of the Maybach. Claire did not make spontaneous decisions. Her life was scheduled in 15-minute increments by a team of assistants. But tonight, the rules seemed to have evaporated. There's a diner, Claire said slowly. About 6 blocks from here, the Silver Spoon. It's terrible. The neon sign flickers and the booths are cracked. Thomas paused, holding his own coat. He looked at Claire, raising an eyebrow. I know it. They serve breakfast at midnight. They do, Claire said. She gripped her clutch tightly. Lily hasn't eaten anything but a plain dinner roll all night. She didn't formulate it as a question. It was a statement of fact hovering in the space between them. Thomas studied her face. He saw the hesitation, the quiet dread of returning to the isolation of her massive, empty penthouse. He smiled, a genuine lopsided grin that made him look 10 years younger. A plain roll is unacceptable, Thomas said. He turned to Leo. We are going to get burgers, with Lily. Leo pumped a fist in the air. Yes, finally, real food. Thomas tapped the table to get Lily's attention. He pointed to Leo, then signed, Burger? French fries? Lily looked at Claire, her eyes wide with disbelief. Claire nodded. Lily's face lit up, and a milkshake. She signed to Thomas, her hands emphatic. Obviously, Thomas signed back. They walked out together. The exit was a stark contrast to their entrance. Claire didn't pause for the photographers. She kept herself positioned between the flashing cameras and the rest of the group, a human shield shepherding them out the heavy glass doors of the Grand Hotel. The December air hit them like a physical blow, shocking and crisp. The noise of the lobby was cut off instantly as the doors sealed shut behind them. The valet rushed forward, waving the ticket for Claire's Maybach. Ms. Montgomery bringing it around now. Cancel it, Claire said. We're walking. The valet stared at her, dumbfounded. He looked at her silk dress, her bare shoulders, and the biting wind coming off the harbor. Ma'am? I said cancel it, Claire repeated, her tone leaving no room for argument. She turned to Thomas. He was looking at her, amused. He unbuttoned his heavy wool overcoat, took it off, and held it out. You're going to freeze before we cross the street, Thomas said. Claire looked at the coat. It wasn't cashmere. It smelled faintly of old coffee and cedar wood. It was practical, worn, and warm. She didn't refuse. She slipped her arms into the sleeves. It was massive on her, swallowing her frame entirely, but the heavy fabric instantly blocked the wind. Thank you, Claire said softly. Thomas nodded. He reached down and took Leo's hand. Claire looked down at Lily. Lily was already standing next to Leo. She reached out, bypassing Claire entirely, and grabbed the sleeve of Leo's coat. Leo didn't pull away. They began to walk, 4 figures moving away from the flashing lights and the towering hotel, heading into the dark, freezing streets of the city. For the first time in years, Claire wasn't leading the charge. She was just walking, surrounded by the quiet, comfortable silence of a shared language. The Silver Spoon Diner was a fluorescent assault on the senses. The air smelled aggressively of burnt coffee, bleached countertops, and decades of vaporized grease. A bell above the door violently announced their arrival, cutting through the low hum of the refrigerators and the sizzle of a flat-top grill. It was magnificent. Claire guided Lily toward a corner booth. The red vinyl was cracked and repaired with strips of silver duct tape that had long since lost their adhesive edge. Claire slid in, the delicate silk of her designer gown catching slightly on the rough edge of the table. She didn't care. She pulled Thomas's heavy wool overcoat tighter around her shoulders, the scent of cedar and cold city air grounding her. Lily and Leo scrambled into the opposite side of the booth. They didn't wait for menus. They didn't look around at the three other patrons, a truck driver nursing a mug and two teenagers sharing a plate of fries. They immediately picked up their conversation right where it had left off on the sidewalk. Claire watched them. Under the harsh, unforgiving glare of the overhead tubes, the shadows of the gala were stripped away. She could see every nuance of Lily's face. "You can't put ketchup on a milkshake," Lily signed, her expression conveying a mix of horror and profound judgment. "Watch me," Leo signed back, a dangerous, chaotic glint in his eye. A waitress approached. She was in her 50s, wearing a pink uniform dress that had faded to a dull peach, carrying a pad of green paper. She looked at Claire's gown, then at Thomas's rumpled suit, and finally at the two kids throwing rapid-fire hand gestures at each other. She didn't blink. She had worked the midnight shift in the city for 20 years. A billionaire in a diner with a rogue architect didn't even make her top 10 weirdest Tuesday nights. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice raspy from a lifetime of unfiltered cigarettes. "Please," Thomas said, "and 2 chocolate milkshakes, the thick ones." He didn't turn to the kids and loudly ask what they wanted. He didn't force them to speak to the waitress. He just tapped the table twice. Both kids looked at him. "Burgers," Thomas signed, raising an eyebrow. Both kids nodded emphatically. "2 cheeseburgers, fries," Thomas translated seamlessly to the waitress. "And a grilled cheese for me. Claire?" "Just the coffee," she said. The waitress nodded, scribbled it down, and walked away. Claire leaned back against the duct-taped vinyl. The tension that permanently lived at the base of her skull, a tight, coiled knot of defensive strategy and maternal anxiety, began to loosen. She wrapped her hands around the thick ceramic mug the waitress dropped off, letting the scalding heat bleed into her palms. "You do that easily," Claire said. She kept her voice low, not wanting to interrupt the silent, chaotic debate happening across the table about the structural integrity of French fries. Thomas looked up from his water glass. "Do what?" "Navigate," Claire said. She gestured vaguely. "The translation, the buffering between them and the rest of the room. You don't make a production out of it." "Neither do you," Thomas pointed out. "I have to. If I don't, people assume she's invisible, or worse, incapable." Claire looked down at her black coffee. "I spend my entire life buying space for her. I buy the best schools, the best private tutors. I threaten school boards with litigation to ensure she has an interpreter for every single field trip. I am constantly building a fortress around her." Thomas leaned forward, resting his forearms on the sticky table. "Fortresses keep the bad things out," he said quietly, "but they keep the people inside trapped too." Claire bristled. Her instincts flared, ready to go to war, ready to defend her choices. She opened her mouth to deliver the kind of verbal evisceration that made junior executives weep. But Thomas didn't back down. He didn't look intimidated. He just looked at her with that same weary, steady gaze. "I'm not criticizing you, Claire," Thomas said, his voice softer now. "I know exactly why you do it. The world is brutal to anyone who doesn't fit its default settings. When Sarah lost her hearing in college, she lost half her friends in 6 months. People just stopped trying. It was too much work to look at her when they spoke. Too much work to text instead of call. The world is lazy." He picked up a paper napkin and began folding it. "So you build the fortress. You buy the compliance of the world. Because you can." He looked up, his eyes locking onto hers. "But you can't buy community. You can't buy the feeling of walking into a room and not having to translate your very existence." Claire's throat tightened. The anger dissolved, leaving behind a hollow, aching exhaustion. "She has no friends, Thomas," Claire whispered. The admission felt like a physical defeat. She had never said it out loud, not to her board, Not to her ex-husband who had conveniently relocated to London shortly after Lily's diagnosis. Not to anyone. She has playdates that I orchestrate. She has classmates who are polite to her. But she has no one who speaks her language. Until tonight. Thomas stopped folding the napkin. He looked across the table at Lily. She was currently laughing, a silent, shoulder-shaking laugh, as Leo attempted to balance a French fry on his nose. She has Leo now, Thomas said. It wasn't a platitude. It was a statement of fact. The waitress returned, dropping heavy white plates onto the table. The smell of charred meat, salt, and grease filled the small space. Thomas tapped the table again. Eat. Then play, he signed. The kids attacked the food with the starved ferocity of children who had been denied anything edible for hours. For the next half hour, Claire didn't think about the Singapore overhead. She didn't think about the hostile takeover of a rival tech firm. She sat in a dingy diner at midnight, drinking terrible coffee, watching her daughter be a fiercely normal, messy, happy 7-year-old. She looked at Thomas. He was eating his grilled cheese, occasionally signing a reprimand to Leo when the boy tried to steal one of Lily's fries. He was entirely unbothered by Claire's wealth. He wasn't trying to impress her. He wasn't intimidated by her. He was just a father, sharing the trenches. By 1 a.m., the sugar rush had crashed into a hard wall. Leo was slumped against the diner window, his eyes half closed, a half-eaten fry dangling from his hand. Lily was fighting a losing battle against gravity, her head nodding lower and lower until it finally rested against the table, her cheek pillowed on her arms. The neon sign outside flickered, casting a stuttering red glow across the sticky tabletop. The spell was ending. The fortress was waiting. Thomas caught the waitress's eye and made a writing motion in the air. A minute later, a small green slip of paper appeared on the table. Claire instinctively reached for her clutch, her fingers brushing the cold metal clasp. Thomas's hand shot out, covering the bill before she could touch it. "Don't," he said. Claire stopped. She looked at his hand, calloused, rough around the knuckles, then up to his face. "Thomas, I can pay for the diner." "I know you can," he said, pulling a worn leather wallet from his back pocket. "You could buy the diner, demolish it, and build a skyscraper. But tonight, I bought the burgers." He tossed a 20 and a 10 onto the table. It was a simple, definitive gesture, a boundary. He wasn't going to let her financial gravity pull him into orbit. Claire slowly pulled her hand back. "Thank you." "You're welcome." He reached over and gently shook Leo's shoulder. "Hey, up. Time to go home, buddy." Leo groaned, a universal sound of childhood misery, and sat up, rubbing his eyes. Claire tapped Lily's arm gently. Lily stirred, blinking against the harsh lights. She looked disoriented for a second, then her eyes found Leo, and she sat up straighter. They shuffled out of the booth. The physical exhaustion was heavy, pulling at their limbs. As they walked toward the door, Claire pulled out her phone. The screen was blinding in the dim light. She had 14 missed calls from her security team and 3 urgent emails from Harrison. She ignored them all. She tapped an app, summoning her driver. They stepped out into the freezing night. The wind had picked up, howling down the concrete canyon of the avenue. "Where's your car?" Claire asked, her voice loud to cut through the wind. 4 blocks down, in the garage near the hotel, Thomas said. He zipped up Leo's coat, pulling the collar tight around the boy's neck. "My driver is 2 minutes away. We'll drop you," Claire stated. Thomas opened his mouth to refuse, to insist on walking, to maintain the separation of their worlds. But he looked at Leo, shivering on the sidewalk, and the bitter cold biting at his own face. He swallowed his pride. "All right. Thank you." A minute later, the Maybach turned the corner, its sleek, predatory headlights slicing through the darkness. It glided silently to the curb in front of the diner, an alien spacecraft landing in a junkyard. The driver leapt out, rushing around to open the heavy rear doors. The stark reality of Claire's life sat idling on the curb. They climbed in. The sudden silence of the soundproofed cabin was deafening after the roar of the wind. The temperature was perfectly regulated at 72 degrees. Thomas gave the driver the address of his apartment in Brooklyn. It wasn't a terrible neighborhood, but it was a world away from Claire's Upper East Side penthouse. The drive was quiet. The kids, sitting between them on the expansive leather bench, were too tired to sign. They just sat side by side, their shoulders touching. When the car finally pulled up to a pre-war brick walk-up, Thomas unbuckled his seatbelt. He looked at Claire. The ambient streetlight caught the sharp angles of her face. She looked tired, but the icy armor was gone. "Thank you," Thomas said. "For the rescue at the gala, and for the company." "Thank you for the coat," Claire said. She moved to take it off. "Keep it," Thomas said quickly. "You still have to get out of the car to get to your building. I'll get it back eventually." He didn't make a big deal of the word eventually, but it hung heavily in the quiet air of the car. It was an opening, a promise of a future interaction. Thomas stepped out of the car. He reached back in to help Leo. Before Leo stepped out, he tapped Lily's knee. Lily looked up, her eyes heavy. "See you later, alligator," Leo signed, his movements sluggish but deliberate. Lily smiled, a small, sleepy thing. After a while, crocodile, she signed back. Leo climbed out. Thomas stood holding the door. He looked at Claire one last time. "Good night, Claire." "Good night, Thomas." He closed the door. The heavy thud severed the connection. The Maybach immediately pulled away from the curb, sliding back into the flow of midnight traffic. Claire sat in the cavernous silence of the back seat. She looked down. Resting on the pristine leather seat next to her was a slightly crumpled, grease-stained napkin from the Silver Spoon Diner. Written on it, in thick black ink, was a phone number. Beneath it, a single word: Playdate. Claire picked up the napkin. She held it carefully, as if it were a fragile piece of glass. She looked over at Lily. Her daughter had already fallen asleep, her head resting against the armrest. Her face was relaxed, peaceful, devoid of the tight, anxious vigilance she normally carried. Claire clutched the napkin in one hand, pulled the collar of the worn wool coat tighter around her neck, and watched the city blur past the tinted window. For the first time in a very long time, the silence didn't feel quite so empty. The executive boardroom of Montgomery Holdings sat on the 42nd floor, a glass and steel panopticon overlooking the gray sprawl of the city. It was Tuesday morning. The air was hyper-filtered, temperature-controlled, and thick with the smell of expensive espresso and predatory ambition. Claire sat at the head of the massive mahogany table. To her left, the legal team was dissecting a merger contract. To her right, Harrison, having seemingly recovered from his dressing down at the gala, was pacing, aggressively pitching a restructuring plan that involved firing 400 people in a fulfillment center. "The automation software effectively neutralizes the need for human oversight on the floor," Harrison was saying, pointing a laser at a projected graph. "We trim the fat, overhead drops by 22%, and the shareholders see the bump by Q3. Claire stared at the graph. It was a clean, upward-trending line. It represented efficiency. It represented victory. It also meant absolutely nothing to her today. Her hand was resting in her lap, out of sight beneath the edge of the heavy table. Her thumb was absent-mindedly rubbing the edge of a folded paper napkin. It was rough, cheap, and still smelled faintly of fryer oil. She had carried it in her purse for 3 days. "Claire?" Harrison prompted, pausing his laser pointer assault. The room fell silent, 14 executives waiting for the verdict. "Do we have the green light to initiate the severance packages?" Claire looked away from the projection. She looked at Harrison. He was waiting for her to do what she always did: calculate the numbers, ignore the human cost, and execute the play. "No," Claire said. The single word dropped like a lead weight. Harrison blinked, his confident smile faltering. "No? But the projections—" "The projections are sterile, Harrison," Claire interrupted, her voice quiet, but carrying effortlessly to the back of the room. "You are neutralizing human oversight, which means you are isolating the remaining skeleton crew in a 1,000,000-square-foot warehouse with automated machinery. Have you accounted for the safety risks? The isolation fatigue? The fact that people aren't algorithms you can just trim?" The boardroom was dead silent. The general counsel stared at Claire as if she had suddenly started speaking Aramaic. Claire Montgomery did not care about isolation fatigue. She cared about EBIT Day. But Claire was currently remembering the hollow, exhausted look in her 7-year-old daughter's eyes at a table full of billionaires. She was remembering Thomas Reed's voice in the diner. The world is brutal to anyone who doesn't fit its default settings. Rework the proposal, Claire ordered, standing up and ending the meeting entirely. Find the savings in the supply chain logic, not the floor workers. We aren't building fortresses out of people's livelihoods today. She didn't wait for a response. She walked out, leaving a wake of stunned executives behind her. Back in her office, the silence was total. Claire walked to the private closet tucked behind a mahogany panel. She opened it. Hanging next to 3 perfectly tailored $2,000 blazers was a heavy, slightly worn charcoal wool overcoat. She reached out and touched the sleeve. For 3 days, Lily's behavior had fundamentally shifted. The rigid, closed-off posture had cracked. On Sunday morning, Lily had refused to wear a stiff sweater, signing fiercely, "Leo said sweaters are just prisons for your arms." On Monday, instead of her usual silent ride to school, she had asked Claire how to sign the word dinosaur. A single brief collision with someone who spoke her language had jump-started her daughter's spirit. Claire walked to her desk. She pulled the diner napkin from her pocket and smoothed it flat on the glass surface. The black ink was slightly smudged. Claire was a woman who negotiated billion-dollar acquisitions without a spike in her heart rate. But as she picked up her phone to dial a 10-digit number written on a napkin, her hands were actually trembling. The vulnerability of it was terrifying. In the corporate world, reaching out meant you needed something, which meant you were weak. But she wasn't a CEO right now. She was a mother. She didn't call. She opened a text thread. She typed, deleted, and typed again. Finally, she settled on a message devoid of corporate polish. "This is Claire. The coat is taking up space in my closet. Does the playdate offer still stand?" She hit send before she could overthink it. She placed the phone face down on the desk and walked to the window, staring out at the skyline, bracing for the silence. The phone vibrated against the glass desk less than 30 seconds later. Claire flipped it over. "Thomas. It's an excellent coat. Museum of Natural History. Saturday, 10 a.m. Dinosaurs don't require translation." Claire let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. A genuine, unguarded smile broke across her face. "Saturday," she typed back, 10 a.m. The main hall of the Museum of Natural History was a cavernous space of vaulted ceilings and echoing footsteps. The Barosaurus skeleton reared up in the center, a towering monument of bone caught in perpetual silent combat. It was 9:55 a.m. The morning light poured through the massive windows, casting long, clean shadows across the marble floor. It was perfect lighting. No shadows to obscure hand shapes, no flashing strobe lights, no dim, moody ambiance. Claire stood near the ticketing desk, holding a matte black garment bag. She had traded her silken armor for a thick cashmere sweater, dark jeans, and boots. Lily stood next to her, practically vibrating with kinetic energy. She was scanning the incoming crowds, her eyes wide, entirely unbothered by the sheer volume of people. "There!" Lily signed suddenly, tapping Claire's arm with bruising force. She pointed toward the heavy brass doors. Thomas and Leo were walking inside. Thomas was wearing a thick flannel shirt over a thermal, looking even more ruggedly out of place among the Upper West Side Museum crowd than he had at the gala. Leo was wearing a beanie pulled low over his ears. Leo spotted them first. He didn't wave. He immediately dropped into a full, dramatic ASL narrative from 30 feet away. The train was broken, Leo signed, his hands making the sweeping, exaggerated motions of a subway car grinding to a halt. We were trapped underground with rats the size of dogs. Lily let go of Claire's hand. She ran forward, closing the distance. "You are a liar," Lily signed back, a massive grin on her face. "Rich people have exterminators. The rats are small." Leo laughed loudly, the sound echoing off the marble. He didn't care who heard him. He turned to his dad, waiting for validation, then turned back to Lily. Come on, I know where the giant squid is. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't wait for the adults. They simply took off together, a flurry of silent, rapid-fire conversation weaving through the crowd of slow-moving tourists. Claire watched them go, a sudden lump forming in her throat. She didn't have to translate. She didn't have to hover. Her daughter was just a kid, running off with a friend. Thomas walked up, stopping a few feet away. He shoved his hands into his pockets. He looked at Claire, taking in the jeans and sweater. "You look human today," Thomas said, his tone entirely casual. "Don't get used to it," Claire replied, though the edge in her voice was entirely gone. She held out the garment bag. "I had it dry cleaned." Thomas took the bag, groaning slightly. "Claire, it's a 6-year-old work coat. You probably spent more dry cleaning it than I spent buying it." "I'm a billionaire, Thomas. If I didn't dry clean it, the universe would collapse in on itself." Thomas laughed. It was a good sound, deep, resonant, and completely unpretentious. Fair enough. They fell into step side by side, following the trail of the two kids who were currently standing beneath a suspended blue whale, fiercely debating whether a shark could beat it in a fight. "Thank you," Claire said quietly, keeping her eyes on Lily. "For this. For Leo. You don't have to thank me for basic human interaction," Thomas said. He looked over at her. "Though I will admit, David Higgins nearly had a stroke when he saw me on Monday. He thinks I have a direct line to the Montgomery throne now." Claire rolled her eyes. "If he bothers you, I'll buy his firm and fire him." Thomas stopped walking. He looked at her, his face deadpan. "You can't just buy people's companies because they annoy me." "Watch me," Claire shot back, a faint smirk playing on her lips. Thomas shook his head, though he was smiling. The fortress mentality. Still there. "It's a very hard habit to break," Claire admitted, her smile fading slightly. She watched Lily's hands moving in a blur as she explained something to Leo. "When you spend 7 years assuming the world is hostile to your child, you forget how to look for the open doors." "I get it," Thomas said gently. He looked at his son. "After Sarah died, I wanted to lock Leo in a room and never let the world touch him again. It's terrifying letting them exist out here, especially when they communicate in a way 90% of the room ignores." He turned his body slightly to face Claire. The bustling noise of the museum seemed to fade into a dull hum around them. "But if you build the walls too high, Claire, you don't just keep the bad out," Thomas said. "You keep people like us out too." Claire looked into his eyes. There was no agenda there, no pitch deck, no networking strategy, no forced sycophancy. Just a man who understood the profound, exhausting weight of keeping a child safe in a world not built for them. For the first time in a decade, Claire didn't feel the need to manage the optics. She didn't feel the need to project invulnerability. She let the wall drop. "I don't want to keep you out," Claire said. The honesty in her own voice startled her. Thomas held her gaze. The weary lines around his eyes softened. He didn't offer a dramatic declaration. He didn't reach out and grab her hand. They were two adults, carrying their own luggage, standing in the middle of a dinosaur exhibit. Instead, he raised his right hand. "Good," Thomas signed, the movement crisp and clear. "Because Leo is demanding we get pizza after this, and I am not paying for it." Claire let out a sudden, bright laugh. It was a sound her board of directors had never heard. She raised her own hands, the signs flowing far more naturally than they had at the gala. "I think Montgomery Holdings can expense a pepperoni pizza," Claire signed back. Up ahead, Lily turned around. She saw her mother signing with Thomas. She saw the relaxed slope of her mother's shoulders. Lily didn't look anxious. She didn't look like she was bracing for a noisy, overwhelming world. She just looked happy. "Hurry up." Lily signed to them, her face bright and open. "The squid is this way." Claire looked at Thomas. He gestured for her to lead the way. They walked forward together, stepping out from beneath the massive shadows of the old bones, and followed their children into the light. Sometimes the greatest wealth we can ever possess isn't measured in bank accounts, but in the rare, beautiful moments we find someone who truly speaks our language. Claire and Thomas proved that bringing down our emotional walls, our fortresses, can lead to the most profound connections of our lives. Did this story touch your heart? What's a moment in your life where someone made you feel seen and understood in a loud world? Drop a comment below and share your story with us. If you loved this journey of ASL, parenthood, and unexpected love, please smash that like button, share it with a friend who needs a reminder that connection is everything, and subscribe to our channel for more deeply human, original stories. We read every single comment,